No, because of the COVID stuff. So we'll go. They can go out to basketball.
It might be down
And what?
Well,
It's like, I don't know, it's good class. We're all
probably.
flying out there. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, how about you? Because they haven't taken. Yes.
So I have to go in, open the garage door, and walk through the fire. So I slip on the garage. You go back up by the deep in the garage. What's up pretty long in the house?
I got nothing. That should be. They should be. But my-
How do you want to your own? I just have a comment.
She's good.
You have a person people? Yes. There's 2 months in the next just. Yeah.
Yes. We're just numbers.
I would like to change. Yeah, it's not.
I can take that. Why is it?
What I should have like a you. I'll set up on this.
Yeah. So I think.
And then put these. Yeah. And I can't see a while. And even though I have to switch back and forth. But when I switch into the RPM side, so. I don't always have. I'm not sure how I get it, or what I get it. What was it?
See you guys. It's like, dude.
And also
Say, she cruise, you guys, yeah, he's down there. This is my dad's house.
For 2 years, I think.
Every single box. That's not easy, man.
Oh, that's good. All right. For this discussion.
Please be seated, thank you. Mr. Cochran, does the plaintiff have another witness?
Dr. Mark Whiting. I'm going to handle the examination.
Okay, thanks.
Whiting, your lending glass.
Sir, if you'd be kind enough, please, to raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you are about to provide is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge?
I do.
Thank you. Welcome. Please have a seat in the witness chair, and the parties indulge me. My computer is down, so I'm going to step over to the clerk station and see if his is working. You have access to Odyssey. We'll get Odyssey. We're off the record, Rick, please. Yeah, can you pull up Odyssey on my?
No.
There it is. I can get that from there, Steve.
Okay,
I can do all that.
you do this.
Yeah.
Okay. Your Honor, may I remove my mask while I'm testifying?
I mean, for just a second?
No, just while I'm testifying.
No.
Okay.
Expand this.
That'll get you there. Okay. Okay. Okay, Mr. Val, please, you may examine the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Whitehill, can you state your name and spell it for the record, please?
Mark Bennett Whitehill, Whitehil.
Doctor, you asked about your mask, the protocol in this courtroom is we keep our masks on. However, I'd ask you to keep your voice up so the court reporter can hear what you're saying, and also really importantly, you and I don't talk over each other for the record, okay?
Sure.
What is your profession, doctor?
I'm a licensed psychologist, certified sex offender treatment provider, and developmental disabilities professional.
And you said you're a licensed psychologist. What does that mean to be a licensed psychologist in this state? Well, let me ask you, are you licensed in Washington?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What does that mean?
Well, that means one has obtained the requisite education and training, which requires a doctorate in a psychology or related field, like counseling psychology, that one has obtained appropriate supervision. It's been a while since I've looked at the number of hours required to have a supervised practice, which I completed, in fact, decades ago. But there is, in addition to standards for acquiring a psychologist license, there are standards for maintaining a psychologist license, and in particular, the need for regular continuing education, what we call CPE in my field. And I believe that's 40 hours every 2 years.
Doctor, how long have you been a licensed psychologist in Washington State?
Since August of 1987.
And have you been a licensed psychologist? Has it been uninterrupted since 1987?
Yes, it has, uninterrupted.
Can you briefly describe for the court what your educational background is, starting in college, and then telling us, well, let's start with college.
College, I have a bachelor's degree with a major in psychology from Hamilton College in Upper New York State.
And did you obtain a master's degree after you obtained your bachelor's degree?
I did. My bachelor's degree was conferred in 1976. My master's degree was conferred in 1978 from the University of Pittsburgh in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
And then you mentioned, I believe, that you also have a PhD.
I do.
Okay. And in what field and when did you obtain that degree?
Both my master's and doctoral degrees are in clinical psychology. I obtained my doctorate in clinical psychology in 1986, also from the University of Pittsburgh.
And could you also, Dr. Whitehill, briefly, I'm saying briefly because Judge Dixon is familiar, there's no jury here, but when you briefly walk through your work background, just tell us what you've done, starting from obtaining your PhD to the present.
I obtained my PhD while an intern working, actually, I'm sorry, that's not true, because I obtained my PhD in 1986. By that time, I was fully a staff psychologist and no longer an intern, while working in Wisconsin's oldest and largest maximum security prison, if you will, the WSP equivalent of Wisconsin, which is called Waupun Correctional Institution. There I was a staff psychologist. I worked there until later in 1986, when I assumed a staff position working under contract for the State of Alaska Department of Corrections in Juneau, where the state prison and county jail are rolled into one. There I developed, implemented, and evaluated a sex offender treatment program for individuals that are both incarcerated within the state of Alaska and those on probation or parole within the community of Juneau. I did that for roughly 15 months. And then a private practice opportunity developed in Tacoma, where I joined the practice of Richard Peterson, an established practitioner whose work involved forensic evaluations of various sorts, as well as providing clinical work to individuals and treatment work for sex offenders.
And was that 1987, Dr. Whitehill?
Yes, that since May of 1987, I've been in private practice.
And you mentioned that your private practice had a clinical aspect and a forensic aspect. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
Describe again briefly, the clinical aspect of your practice over the last 30 years.
Well, the clinical aspect involves providing therapy and evaluative services to individuals lacking any legal component. Persons who would present with a variety of concerns, such as depression, anxiety, marital distress. Sometimes mental health evaluations would be requested for such persons. And I did that, my clinical practice, for roughly 25 years, seeing clients without any legal dimension, which we would call forensic clients.
Let me, before you talk about the forensic, Dr. Whitehill, as part of your clinical practice during those 25 years, did you have the opportunity to treat victims of childhood sexual abuse?
I did.
And tell us about the forensic aspect of your practice.
The forensic aspects of my practice involve both conducting forensic therapy, which would be typically individuals who've committed crimes of sexual violence, ranging from misdemeanors to so-called sexually violent predators. The evaluative aspect of my forensic practice involves conducting assessments of individuals within the realm of criminal law who may be not competent to proceed to trial. There may be some question as to their competency to waive Miranda. Also, within the criminal realm are evaluations, what we call criminal responsibility assessments, which involve assessing the extent to which a particular defendant may qualify for a mental health defense of either diminished capacity or insanity. And then there is the mitigation component, typically appropriate at sentencing, where mitigating mental health factors may be relevant, though at times mitigation issues may be sought in advance of trial. And by that I mean for individuals who may be candidates for the Persistent Offender Accountability Act, with either 2 strikes or 3 strikes, you're out, as they say.
Doctor, as part of your forensic practice, have you had the opportunity to evaluate victims of childhood sexual abuse?
I have.
And would it be a fair statement that you clinically treated hundreds of victims of child sexual abuse?
It would be fair to say that, yes.
Would it be a fair statement that you have, on the forensic side, evaluated hundreds of victims of child sexual abuse?
I would say easily 200, if not more.
And you also have, I think you that's on your CV, but you testified that you're a specialist in sex offender treatment as well.
That is correct.
Okay, so you've treated victims and offenders?
Yes, I've been treating offenders of sexual abuse since September of 1981, so more than 40 years.
Doctor, over the last 30 years, what percentage of your practice has been clinical and what percentage has been forensic? Maybe I shouldn't assume it hasn't changed, but just generally.
Well, today my practice is almost exclusively forensic in nature.
How about over time?
At other times, it's been as much as 40% clinical and 60% forensic. When I first came to Tacoma, Dr. Peterson's practice was primarily forensic, but there were certainly significant clinical cases as well. And that the percentage, of course, varies over time, depending on referral sources. Once, for example, the sexually violent predator statute was enacted, the 7109, there was a shift to evaluating individuals at various stages of the civil commitment process for so-called sexually violent predators.
Doctor, again, focusing on the forensic, you were hired by the plaintiffs in these cases, correct?
That is correct.
Have you had an opportunity to work with both? Strike that. Have you been hired by both the plaintiffs and the defense in your forensic practice?
I have.
And over the last 30 years, can you give us a sense of what percentage times you're hired by the defense and what percentage you're hired by the plaintiff?
Well, again, over that significant a time span, the percentage varies. But I would estimate that in the last, let's say 20 years, there were primarily evaluations requested by defendants counsel or defense counsel. Though within recent years, within the last 10 years, I would say maybe 80% of my work has been at behest of plaintiff's counsel.
Over the span of 30 years, well, how did the division, if you can, and maybe you can't answer that, but can you?
Well, early on in my practice, I was asked primarily by defense attorneys to evaluate clients in the context of civil litigation. And that might have been between 70 and 80% 30 years ago. But over time, depending on the cases, depending on who contacts me, that's not something over which I have control. I don't seek out particular kinds of assessments.
So you've worked on both sides?
I have.
Doctor, let's shift to these cases. What were you asked to do by plaintiff's counsel in these cases involving OELC or the Olympia Early Learning Center?
Well, initially, I was asked to conduct evaluations of 2 children, 2 of the 6 children who were placed at the Olympia Early Learning Center to assess for psychological injury, and if found, to develop treatment plans for them.
Okay. And what 2 children were they? We've been mostly using their initials in this courtroom.
Those were AK, also known as Junior, and SA.
Were you asked to provide any documentation or workup for the other 4 plaintiffs?
I was.
Okay, and what were you asked to do?
The other 4 plaintiffs had been previously evaluated by Dr. John Conti, and I was asked in reviewing Dr. Conti's reports to make, if you will, treatment recommendations for each of them, based on what Dr. Conti had found.
And when you're referring, we're going to look at this a little more closely, but when you say treatment recommendations, what are you talking about in general?
Well, the treatment recommendations for individuals who have been sexually abused takes the form of a mental health life care plan, which recognizes the long-term consequences of sexual abuse throughout the lifespan, as well as the multiplicity of domains in which the impact of sexual abuse is experienced. And so the life care plans provide a schema or set of therapy directives to account for the extensive impact of sexual abuse on the assessed individual.
And so you were asked to do a forensic evaluation for plaintiffs, AK for junior and SA, and then a life care plan or a treatment assessment for four plaintiffs that were forensically evaluated by Dr. Conti. Is that your testimony?
That is my testimony.
Did you also prepare a life care plan or a treatment plan for SA and AK?
I did.
And are you prepared to testify about those treatment plans today?
I am.
What materials did you review in general in performing the evaluations of SA and AK?
Well, primary among the materials was the extensive documentation.
Doctor, it's challenging with the masks, but you need to speak up and so the court reporter can hear you. I just didn't hear this beginning.
No problem. Okay. Primary among the documents reviewed was what I call the criminal file involving Eli Tabor, the perpetrator of the sexual abuse. There were significant documents that were listed in my report, including, original police reports, and really what I call the DOC file, as well as information from DSHS, from Children's Administration regarding the referral.
And do you recall when you were retained to evaluate plaintiffs SA and AK?
Yes, I have a letter from Darrell Cochran dated August 11th, 2011.
Let's turn. Did you have did you know? Let's strike that. Let's turn to plaintiff SA and let's start with that child. Your Honor,
Yes.
You may have your reports with you, Doctor, but I'm not asking you to look at the exhibit.
Okay.
For the court's reference, that's plaintiff's exhibit number 62. So, Dr. Whitehill, 62, well, why don't you identify for the record what exhibit 62 is?
This is my evaluation of SA dated November 11th, 2011.
And let's look at the date. And Dr. Whitehill, you can look at the screen or you can look at the exhibit book, whichever is easier on your eyes. The report is dated November 11th, 2011. Is that the date that you sent your report to Mr. Cochran?
It is.
Right. And can I presume that you did your evaluation and sometime earlier than that?
That is correct.
Okay. Tell us what your evaluation consisted of.
What consisted of reviewing the documents listed, which in addition to the DOC file also includes the complaint for damages and other documents Mr. Cochran had sent to me. It includes the direct interview of the mother of SA, that would be Amanda Myrick, as well as an interview of SA directly by me. Finally, it would include...
Let me stop you there. I'm sorry to interrupt, but on page 1 of your November 11th report, you talk about a clinical interview and an observational assessment of SA. What's the difference between a clinical interview and an observational assessment?
An observational assessment is to see how SA interacts when engaged in a kind of a free play activity. There are certain markers of children who have been subjected to traumatic events that may be apparent, including fearfulness, difficulty articulating of their experience. And so we provide for children that young a variety of toys and other games that they may enjoy playing.
What, we're not going to go through every line in your report, but tell us what of note you observed in either the clinical interviews of mom and son or your observational assessment.
There were certainly concerns raised by mom with respect to the behaviors that she noted in her son. He had made some disturbing comments about his interactions with Mr. Tabor. The child himself was seen as notably kind of withdrawn. And just referencing my report here. That as I note here that on page 6, I said his speech appeared notably compromised. He initially did not say that things happened to him that he didn't like, but acknowledged later that things did happen to him that he did not like. Generally, I would say that SA appeared withdrawn and taciturn.
And then I note from on page 3 and 4 of your report that it looks like you also reviewed records from Detective Cole, and is that correct?
That is correct.
And is that part? Is that part of your history taking when you evaluate an abuse victim like this?
Sure. To the extent that records are available, it behooves the evaluator to carefully scrutinize those records. And in this case, those records were particularly relevant.
If you turn to page 4 of your report, first full paragraph, you reference what Tabor acknowledged he did to the young child essay, correct?
Yes.
Why is that important?
A disclosure by...
I apologize for interrupting you, Doctor and Mr. Fowler. It appears to the court that I don't have the same exhibit, bench copy exhibit. Are you on 60?
I'm on 62, Your Honor.
Yeah, my 62 is different than your 62.
Oh, okay. I apologize.
That's okay. My 62 is 3 pages long. It's Dr. Whitehill's mental health care plan.
When is exhibit 647? I mean, yeah, I thought that was
Off the record.
Yeah, let's go off the record.
Okay, what is it?
So Philadelphia is exhibit 647.
Okay. Thanks. Plaintiffs, or excuse me, 647. Okay. Okay, let's go back on the record, please. And while off the record, the court and the parties had a discussion with respect to the exhibit that is in front of the witness, and it has been determined that the witness is viewing exhibit 647.
My apologies, Doctor.
That's okay.
Just so we're all clear, we're looking at 647, and this is your November 11th, 2011 evaluation report, right?
Yes.
So turn to page 4 of 647, please. Is this part of the history that you took with regard to the plaintiff essay?
I wouldn't call it necessarily part of a history per se, since that typically refers to what the client or significant other told me. But it is historical in the sense that it comes from the documentation, in particular the police reports regarding Mr. Taylor.
And what was of note in terms of what Tabor acknowledged that he did to the child for you from a forensic perspective?
Well, he apparently readily acknowledged multiple instances of rape and molestation, child rape and molestation. That included oral rape, anal rape. He talks about having performed oral sex with him between 10 and 30 times. So clearly this was a very severe and chronic abuse history that Tabor provided law enforcement.
And if you look at the next paragraph, you reference Detective Cole's forensic interview with Essay. And here it appears that Essay reports that the touching occurred 50 times. Do you see that?
I do.
Let me ask you to draw on your experience treating sexual offenders and ask you, is it surprising that the victim identifies more frequent abuse than the perpetrator?
Not at all.
And why is that?
Perpetrators frequently misrepresent both the nature of what they've done, the frequency of what they've done, the number of victims they may have, the presence of what we call denial in the sex offender perpetrator population is high and exists on many levels.
And why is that?
The reasons vary, but most commonly involve shame, embarrassment, fear of possible additional legal peril. But shame is a fairly common experience that often minimizes the true extent of the offense behavior.
In this case, you have a disclosure from both perpetrator and victim, correct?
That is correct.
And in addition, did you talk about the details of abuse with Essay or his mother, or did you focus on other things?
With his mother, I did.
Okay. And is there a reason that you didn't talk about the details of the abuse with Essay?
Well, he seemed indisposed to talk about that. He was able to concede that some bad things had happened to him, but beyond that, was not forthcoming, which is not surprising in a child of his age.
Okay. You also did some testing, correct?
That's correct.
Can you tell the court what testing you did and why? And again, in general, I'm not asking you for the results right now. Tell us what you did.
We had his mother complete something called the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales, which is a measure of developmental competency across 4 major life domains and supplemental behavioral domains.
Any other testing that you had performed or had performed?
I do not believe so.
And what was in general the results of that testing?
Well, there were deficits seen in what we might expect of a child of Essay's age. So at the time that I saw him, he would have been 6 years of age. And comparing his level of developmental competency to other 6-year-olds, results in several areas in which he was found to be lower than, or even significantly lower than, his age peers.
In terms of the diagnostic impression section of your report, or exhibit 647, and this would be on page 8, Doctor, and let me know if you have that. And you made certain diagnostic, you made certain diagnoses in this case, correct? Right. What were those diagnoses?
Well, the first one would be sexual abuse of a child. This is a child who has been clearly sexually victimized, repeatedly so, and severely so. There's also evidence in the record on what his mother reported that he satisfies criteria for attention deficit disorder, as well as an anxiety disorder, not otherwise specified. That is not a particular kind of anxiety, like generalized anxiety or phobia. And finally, given his behavioral difficulties, he would also satisfy diagnostic criteria for a disruptive behavior disorder.
Let me ask you, Doctor, your second or your third diagnosis, anxiety disorder. Do you have an opinion as to whether the anxiety disorder was caused by the sexual abuse you suffered?
I'd say the likelihood is high that it was, in the sense that anxiety is one of the more common manifestations of the impact of sexual abuse. For example, what we often see in abuse survivors are dimensions of post-traumatic stress disorder. That is an anxiety condition.
Doctor, the standard we use is more probably true than not. Is it your opinion, to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, that the anxiety disorder that you identified was related to the child's sexual abuse on a more probable than not basis?
It is.
How about the disruptive behavior disorder? Do you have an opinion, or did you form an opinion in November of 2011, whether that disruptive behavior disorder was related in whole or in part to the sexual abuse this child suffered?
I did.
And what is that opinion?
It is.
Again, on a more probably not standard
yes.
basis. Okay. And how about the attention deficit disorder? I assume that that was not caused by. Well, let me ask you: do you have an opinion as to how the attention deficit disorder is related to the child's sexual abuse?
I do not have an opinion.
Let me ask you in general, with children who may suffer from attention deficit disorders, how does being severely abused affect those behaviors over time?
Clearly, to the extent a child is distracted by the presence of fear or anxiety, their capacity to engage in sustained attention can be compromised. So it's not necessarily independent of the sexual abuse. I just didn't have enough data at the time of my assessment to conclude beyond or to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty that it was a function of being sexually abused.
And you have a global assessment of functioning current level 58. Can you translate for us what that means?
That would mean moderately severe psychopathology.
Moderately severe
psychopathology.
You then have a section in your report, Dr. Whitehill, entitled Forensic Conclusions. Do you see that on exhibit 647?
I do.
And tell us what conclusion number 1 is. Why don't you tell us rather than my reading the record?
Well, conclusion number 1 simply indicates that the fact of the abuse itself is not in dispute. We have clear disclosures both by the perpetrator as well as the victim that sexual abuse had occurred.
How about finding number 2 or conclusion number 2, where you state essay evidences notable behavioral and developmental deficits at this time, including significantly impaired receptive and expressive communication, impulse control, and attention deficit deficits and behavioral acting out, e.g. lying. To what extent is conclusion number 2 related to the child sexual abuse essay suffered?
I would say largely related. That is, I don't know that I can say completely, but largely.
Largely?
Yeah, to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, I can say that it's largely related to being sexually abused.
And Doctor, your forensic conclusion number 3, you talk about, it states sexual abuse of children is a known pathogen having ramifications on brain development, emotional regulation, self-image, interpersonal competence, and cognitive efficacy. At present, deficits are evident in some of these areas in NL, and I assume that's a typo, and you meant SA, correct?
In my report, it says SA,
Okay.
the report that I have here. So I'm not sure. You may have a draft version of it.
Right, I was looking at the incorrect version. Yeah, you were referring to SA, correct?
Yes.
All right. And what's the basis for that finding? That those problems are related to the child sex abuse?
There is a robust literature on the impact of sexual abuse. It was robust at the time I wrote this report. Today, it's even more voluminous regarding the impact and the various ways in which sexual abuse compromises a child's functioning. And we know even today much more about that and the long-term impact that persists throughout one's life. And
I'm curious, you say that it has ramifications on brain development. What do you mean by that? I'm sure we can talk all afternoon about that, but just in a very succinct way.
Well,
what does the literature tell us about that?
It tells us a lot. It tells us that the brains of children who are sexually abused are smaller than those of non-abused children. It tells us that serotonin levels, which are related to the regulation of mood, are deficient in sexual abuse survivors compared to a non-abused population. The literature actually these days is, as I say, quite extensive and goes beyond even what I'm citing here.
Look at your conclusion number 4, and you talk about the long-term consequences of childhood sexual abuse. Can you expound for the court on what that paragraph means and what you were conveying to us as essay attorneys?
The long-term consequences of sexual abuse, we know, research tells us that children who are sexually abused compared to their non-abused peers have lower levels of educational accomplishment, have more compromised occupational accomplishment, have greater physical health challenges throughout life, are more likely to engage in substance abuse, more likely, especially in boys, to engage in criminal conduct. Again, there are a host of maladies that are consequential to sexual abuse in childhood.
Yeah. Dr. The essay and the others were very young children. Do you have an opinion as to how a young child is affected by childhood sexual abuse as opposed to, say, an adolescent or even a 7, 8, 9-year-old?
Yes. Young children, especially those who are not especially verbal, are nonetheless affected by sexual abuse. And while possibly to a lesser degree than older children who have some recognition of the inherent wrongfulness of the abuse, what we've come to discover is that young children, and I'm talking about children younger than the age of 4, show a variety of psychological maladies that are associated with sexual abuse. In one Dutch study, for example, there was something akin to 69% of the population. Let me see if I'm, yes, that was, I'm sorry, I misquoted. 61% of the population of children studied who were known sexual abuse survivors before the age of 4 had diagnosable mental health conditions when evaluated several years later. So there is, despite the limited memory, limited language development, the effects are significant. And if I can just illustrate one point about that, one of the premier researchers in the area of traumatic stress has written a book that came out in 2014 called The Body Keeps the Score, which is to say that even when there is no cognitive recognition of or explicit memory of what has occurred, there is, if you will, body knowledge of abuse that will have an impact on the child's later years, both in late childhood, in adolescence, and even in adulthood.
Is that fairly well established in the literature and the case studies?
It is.
And you also prepared a mental health life care plan for SA, correct?
I did.
And Your Honor, I just want to make sure, since I speak up, exhibit number 1 that it's connected, and if not, I'll find it. And yeah, turn to exhibit 62, Doctor, and can you confirm for us that 62 is your mental health life care plan?
Yes, I can confirm that.
Okay. Your Honor, I want to make sure we're all. Thanks. Well, let's walk through this with SA, and you created mental health life care plans or treatment recommendations for the other 6 or the other 5 children as well, correct?
That is correct.
But we'll spend a little more time on this because they're created in the same format. But for starters, what is this? What is a mental health life care plan?
It's a prediction with respect to needed services, needed therapeutic services over the lifespan of the client, in this case SA, to optimize functioning, which is to say to remediate the impact of the trauma to which the individual was subjected. In this case, of course, that would be sexual abuse. And
you are projecting with the child who you said was 6 at the time you saw him.
Yes.
You're projecting into the future what type of treatment he, or in other cases, she may need, right?
That is correct.
How can you do that? How do you know?
Well, the truth is we don't know for sure, but this is a prediction based on best available knowledge regarding the long-term impact of child sexual abuse. Like any predictions, it is based on certain assumptions about what we know about a particular child and what we know about the lasting impact of the trauma to which the child was subjected. So in this case of SA, we have very good knowledge. Of course, among the children here, we have the best knowledge of the extent to which SA was sexually victimized.
And is that because you have a disclosure by FERPAN?
We have disclosures, we have lengthy records, we have a psychosexual evaluation, we have a lot of information here. And so based on that information, we can make a prediction to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, while recognizing that it's not an absolute prediction and that many intervening variables could occur, both positive and negative.
So in other words, you can't look in a crystal ball and know exactly what's going to happen to SA in his life, but to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, you can opine on the likely problems that child would have as an adolescent, adult, and what care he would need.
Yes,
Is that accurate?
that is accurate.
And so we're clear, it's your opinion on a more probable than basis that this child is abused.
I'm sorry, I missed the last
It's
part.
I'm just summarizing, it's your opinion on a more probable than basis that this child was abused, correct?
Yes,
And it's also your opinion that that child was displaying symptoms related to the abuse as of the time you saw that child in 2011, right?
yes,
And I assume, looking at your life care plan, that it's your opinion that that child will suffer psychological issues and problems in the future and will need treatment. Is that accurate?
that is accurate.
Let's walk the court through this life care plan so we all have an understanding of it. You have a section called modality. What does that mean?
Be the nature of the therapeutic intervention.
And you also have a section entitled frequency and cost prior to assault, and nothing there. And I assume that's because there was no treatment prior to the assault, correct?
That is my understanding.
And then you have a section entitled frequency and cost due to molestation, oral and anal rape, and its consequences.
Yes,
What does that column indicate?
just identifies the nature of the trauma for which treatment is needed.
And I see that you're suggesting that SA is going to require, likely going to require individual outpatient psychotherapy, and you have it broken into phases, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Can you explain that?
Yes. This model is based on the work of Gilbert Kleiman, a San Francisco psychiatrist who's written and treated hundreds, if not thousands, of survivors of sexual abuse. The model presupposes that therapy will be needed throughout the lifespan, as opposed to what I had previously thought in advance of my consultation with Dr. Kleiman, that we would prescribe a finite number of sessions for 3 years, and that would be it. And that was before Dr. Kleiman introduced me to the literature from diverse fields such as epidemiology, psychoanalysis, and psychiatry, literature that as a psychologist I would generally not be familiar with, in which the long-term impact of sexual abuse and its consequences in various levels of adult functioning persist throughout the lifespan. So the 3-phase outpatient psychotherapy in essence provides a framework for optimizing psychosocial functioning of the client, in this case SA, throughout the life cycle.
And it looks like what you're suggesting is, as a small child, 3 years of weekly visits to a therapist.
Yes.
And then there's a cost associated with that.
Right.
150 sessions at $175 a session,
Right.
of $26,250, right?
That is correct.
And then it also looks like you are suggesting in phase 2, weekly sessions over 3 years when SA is a young adolescent with a similar or identical cost.
Yes.
And then phase 3, you're suggesting monthly sessions over the next 68 years or lifespan with a cost of $142,800, correct?
That is correct.
So you're opining that SA could be in therapy for the rest of his life?
Yes, although it would seem to me that, especially when we're talking about his adult life, we would typically conceptualize monthly sessions as kind of booster sessions, kind of catch up how things been going, as opposed to the kind of intensive therapy that he would be receiving during the first 6 years of this plan.
And then you also suggest in column 1 couples therapy as being recommended, but you have a caveat in friends, which is needed in the event of the inception of intimate relationship, and then you have a recommendation on sessions over time, $17,500, but it's in friends. And as I read that, I'm assuming, obviously, if he's not in an intimate relationship, he's not going to need that therapy.
That is correct. Impaired relationship performance is one of the more common consequences of child sexual abuse. And so sometimes the impairment is so severe that we have an individual who's effectively absent of intimacy in his or her adult life. But in the event that that's not the case for SA, as we certainly hope to be the case, have couples therapy to address the likely impaired relationship issues that are a function of having been sexually abused as a child is present here.
Why couldn't he deal with the issues he's experiencing in his relationship in his regular therapy sessions without his partner?
Well, typically, once we have a dyadic connection, which is to say he has a partner, the partner's input into the therapeutic process is critical, since the relationship becomes the focus and not the client himself. If you will, we say in the field that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And here we have a dyadic connection. And so the partner's presence is a critical part of therapy.
You also recommend group therapy. And again, you have a recommendation of 300 sessions at $75 for $22,500 as the cost. I'll ask you the same question. Why would he need group therapy if he is undergoing individual therapy?
Well, group therapy is a distinct treatment modality in which one's capacity to interact with multiple persons, typically those who have had similar traumatic experiences, allows the individual to develop kind of interpersonal skills that may be deficient, that are anticipated to be deficient, since that is a critical and very common consequence of early sexual abuse. Group therapy provides really a unique opportunity to develop interpersonal skills with a variety of persons of similar background.
And on the next page of your report, in column 1, you reference physical healthcare needs, e.g. stress-related problems, diminished autoimmune capacity. And then you state in the 4th column, increased estimated cost each year over a lifetime, 73 years times $1,500 for a total of $109,500. And I'm assuming what this means, what does this mean?
What it means, again, is that when we look at lifespan developmental data, which means when we look at over time how individuals with a variety of anxiety conditions do in life compared to individuals without such conditions, there is a particular cost associated with that with respect to their physical health. And so autoimmune difficulties are one common consequence that we see in individuals who have been sexually abused in childhood. And what the Marciniak group did in this article that's cited in the Life Care Plan, Marciniak, I believe, is an epidemiologist who studies the prevalence and incidence of diseases and finds, not surprisingly, that there are circumstances in life events such as child sexual abuse that affect the presence and severity of disease across the lifespan. And so this paragraph here, or this aspect of the Life Care Plan, recognizes the likelihood of diminished physical health in the child sexual abuse survivor SA in this case.
So again, you're not opining that he's going to have a diminished autoimmune capacity. What you're suggesting is your experience in the literature bears out that people who are sexually abused as a child can have health-related, physical health-related problems as opposed to emotional.
Exactly, and are more likely to have, compared to a non-abused sample, to have physical health problems.
And you make no pharmacological recommendations. Why?
Well, typically, those recommendations are the province of a licensed physician or ARNP. There have been times I've made recommendations and I've kind of had a caveat about that I'm not a licensed MD or ARNP. One could argue that in light of the symptoms seen at the age of 6, that in fact, SA will at some point require some psychiatric consultation and what we call pharmacotherapy, the use of psychoactive agents to remediate or mitigate particular symptoms. In that case, the cost here would be substantially higher.
So I think what you're telling us is you are a clinical psychologist, not an MD psychiatrist, and you would defer to a psychiatrist on the issue of the pharmacological recommendations.
Yes.
Right. As a clinical psychologist, making therapy recommendations is what you do, right?
Yes. Although sometimes we also make referrals to psychiatrists and other professionals.
The total cost associated with your healthcare plan is $345,000, $345,300, and that's reduced to $327,000, depending on the couples counseling, correct?
Yes.
And the next thing I want to talk to you about in this report is the areas of pain and suffering that in SA are likely to include. And you have generalized fear, diminished trust, self-blame, impaired relationship performance, impaired sense of intimacy, anger management difficulties, disturbed view of self, compromised sexual socialization. I am assuming that what you're stating is as he progresses through developmental stages, he is likely to suffer from one or more of these maladies. Is that accurate, Doctor?
That is correct. And in fact, we see the inception of some of those maladies at the time of the assessment as well.
How so?
Well, for example, the anxiety corresponds to generalized fear. We see behavioral acting out, which is reflective of anger management difficulties. We see some sexualized behaviors, which is a harbinger of compromised sexual socialization. So we're likely to see domains of impairment of this sort as he goes through the life cycle.
And you don't know with any certainty whether he's going to suffer 1, 2, 3, or all of these psychological problems, correct?
Absolutely, I do not know. These are predictions based on the model that I've described and the literature that I've reviewed.
But to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty or probably on that basis, are you comfortable that SA is likely to suffer with one or more of these symptoms?
I am.
Let's turn our attention to plaintiff AK. Is there anything else about SA, something major that I missed asking you about?
I do not think so.
Okay. Let's turn to plaintiff AK, and you turn to Exhibit 63. And again, now I'm paranoid, so I'm going to ask you to identify it, Doctor.
AK is my psychological evaluation of AK.
Is Exhibit 63?
Is Exhibit 63, yes.
Okay. You're honored to direct report with what you have. Great. Now, AK, also known as Junior, is another child that you actually met with and observed, correct?
That is correct.
And did you also meet with one or more of his parents?
I did. I interviewed with his mother. I interviewed his mother, Nicole Bond.
The date on this is January 1919. 2011, and I'm wondering, given that the essay report was November 11th, 2011, like 11, yeah. Is this a typo?
It is. I think I hadn't yet gotten used to the change of year, but this should read January 19th, 2012.
Okay. Without, just because I want to hit the major points.
Okay.
For the court. Do you generally review the same type of documents in assessing KK?
I did.
And was the history that you took and your evaluation generally the same as you described with essay in your last report?
It was.
And I assume you interviewed mom, like you interviewed mom in the last in the essay report, correct?
That is correct.
I want to talk about your interview with Ms. Bond, and I'd like to turn to page 3 of your report.
Okay.
And it said, at daycare, Junior was reported to have taken off his clothes and to have been fidgety, unable to sit still. I assume that came from mom.
That is correct.
And it said that he had been potty trained, but he began having accidents. And then it would take until the weekend until he was comfortable enough to use the toilet. Is there any relationship between potty training and sexual abuse? And the reason I ask is I see this referenced in a number of Dr. Conti's reports as well, where one or more of these victims regressed in their toilet training. Is there some connection, either from your experience in the literature, with that those problems and that regression?
There are two common pathways between toilet training and child sexual abuse. The first is what you describe as regression, in which a child who had achieved a certain level of developmental competency regresses or goes backward in terms of what they're able to do independently or with a previous level of assistance. And the reason is that a traumatic event like sexual abuse is profoundly destabilizing and upsetting, and previously acquired skills may diminish in their capacity. So there's that pathway. Another pathway is that a number of offenders, and it would appear that Mr. Tabor would fit into this category, have a particular interest in diapers or feces or abusing a child during a time when the child is toileting because it corresponds to a particular fetish that an offender might have. And again, there's evidence in other documents we've yet to describe that Mr. Tabor had such a fetish. And so the association between child sexual abuse and the particular fetishistic interest of the perpetrator causes difficulties that may take the form of regression in toileting.
And when you talk about other documents that we may look at, are you talking about Dr. Tabor and Dr. Batson's assessment of the perpetrator, Eli Tabor?
I am.
I'm sorry, Logan and Batson.
Yes.
So the record's clear. You're talking about Dr. Logan's report and Dr. Batson's report, correct?
Yes, although Dr. Batson is not a doctor.
Okay. In what you're referring to in those reports, and perhaps we'll look at those if we have enough time, is they're identifying, I think the term that I think it was Dr. Logan used, they referred to Taylor as being polyperverse. Is that a term you're familiar with in your work? Yes,
it is actually. I think Dr. Logan calls that polymorphous perverse, and Dr. Conti calls it polyperverse.
Okay, what do they mean?
Well, that we have an offender with various dimensions of what we call sexual outlet, or in particular, sexual deviant outlet, in which they are not merely a child molester or a child rapist, but they have also fetishistic interests in like diapers or like feces or urine. There are a variety of what we call in the literature paraphilias, which are dimensions of sexual deviance. And so in Mr. Tabor's case, we have, again, what appears to be a diaper fetish. And also, again, given what he told Dr. Logan, interest in masturbating with feces, and having an interest in urine or having a child urinate or his urinating in a diaper, and that's kind of a sexually arousing stimulus. So we have if you will, a multiplicity of deviances.
And again, we'll look at it maybe a little more closely if we have time, but either in the Batson report or the Logan report, they talked about this polyperverse or this sexual deviant being in a target-rich environment. What did they mean when they referred to Tabor being in a target-rich environment?
Well, it speaks to the fact that a daycare for a child molester couldn't be any more of a site that they would choose. In other words, that would be like the number one site where a child molester could find a range of potential victims, especially if the child molester is in a position of authority, like a teacher or daycare provider, so that they have unrestricted access to a child or children. And so the targets of their predation are readily available and readily accessible.
Did you see any reference in any of the records you reviewed, Dr. Whitehead, indicating that Eli Tabor was changing diapers at the daycare?
I did.
And did you find any reference in the records that you reviewed that Eli Tabor was helping children go to the bathroom?
I did.
And did you see any reference to Eli Tabor using the bathroom at OELC to masturbate with urine, feces, and diapers himself?
I did.
Let's turn back to AK and your interview with Ms. Bond. It says in the third paragraph starting with Ms. Bond became concerned that something might have happened to JR when she went to change his diaper, and he said, "Don't scratch me." What's the significance of that statement, if any?
Well, the implication is that when his diaper had been changed previously, he had been somehow scratched or injured. And so there is, if you will, a learning from that experience that he's now using to caution his mother.
The other comments he made were also concerning, and in quotes, it says, "scratch my butt." Did Ms. Bond tell you that her son had asked her to scratch his butt while changing a diaper?
Yes, that would suggest that he was asking for what we might consider, private or intimate touches from his mother.
And again, it's possible that he's just suggesting, scratch my butt, mom, it itches or something. That's possible, right?
That is possible, yes.
When you look, when you take a history and you interview a collateral witness like mom, or you observe a child, are you looking, doctor, for the totality of information? Is that what you're doing when you're, I noticed you point out a number of things that Ms. Bond told you in your interview, right?
Yeah, well, one, of course, ultimately is looking for where the information is heading, where the information coalesces. One should also be aware, and I try to do this, to look for information that may be disconfirming of a particular hypothesis, or to look for other sources of difficulties in a child, apart from what the implication is in the referral, given what we know about Mr. Tabor, that all the symptoms come from being sexually abused. We know, at least I've come to discover in my review of the histories of Mr. Comte's report, that a number of these parents have had other traumatic events in their lives, have had drug problems or divorces, et cetera. So it's tempting to recognize that there are other extant stressors that may, in fact, create problems in a child. So we have to be more specific and look at what we call the topography of the behavior, which is what is the nature of the behavior, and is it tied to something like abandonment or divorce or physical violence in the home, as opposed to sexual abuse. And sometimes by looking at the nature of the behavior displayed, we can make better inferences as to what the cause of the behavior may be.
Okay. I want to look at, in a little more detail, your interview with Mom. And it said, in addition, Ms. Bond relates to you that Junior asked his mother to tickle him in the groin area and kiss him on the penis. What does that indicate to you as a evaluator?
Well, again, that's a very interesting, what we call topographical behavior, because the nature of that behavior, the form of it, is decidedly sexual. And so the implication is that he knew that such behavior can happen because there was a prior experience that he witnessed or experienced directly. So to me, that's a critical aspect of this report from his mother.
And then at home, Junior was observed to have been humping his younger brother. Similar as a sexualized behavior? Similar
sexualized behavior, yes.
And then says she watched Junior close during bath time and she caught him kissing his brother when they were in bed. Same idea, it's topographical information.
Yes, although less so in the sense that kissing is something that a parent would also do, but that he's kissing his brother. Well, Mom probably kisses his brother as well. But again, if we look at the totality of the data, to use a term you used earlier, we see that the topography kind of trends to sexual rather than simply parental intimacy.
And then in the next paragraph, Ms. Bond, and these were statements Ms. Bond made to you, right? They're not statements that you reviewed in other records. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Okay. And it said Junior was also whispering in Miss Bond's ear and kissing her in a way that was not like a child's kiss, and that's in quotes. Is that something his mom told you?
Yes.
And then she said, in quotes, it was getting a little weird, and that's also in quotes. Was she saying that Junior's behavior was getting a little weird in her opinion?
Yes.
Okay. And then at another point, she tells you that Junior said that Eli kissed him, quote, down there and pointed to his private parts. Is that something that Ms. Bond told you?
Yes.
Your Honor, would this be a good time to break?
Perfect.
It's the usual time.
Court's in recess until 3:10.
All right.
Doctor, we're in recess for
Okay.
like 20 minutes, so free use of bathroom, just don't leave.
I'm not leaving. I feel like Adolf Eichmann in this thing.
Yeah,
You know,
it's
you remember the Eichmann trial? It was in the 60s in Israel. They brought him back from Argentina, wherever.
war criminal.
War from Argentina. They're hanging.
You show her.
It's good. Yeah, good. Glad they have it. So there. Yeah.
And it's up here. Oh, and this is. I didn't do this. But that thing, she did it, and I see it. I can't, I don't know. If somebody wants to tell me how to get it, move them over, I can do it. Control A.
Also, if nothing else, you can ask that.
Yeah. Well, we'll get them. Catherine's in this gene too, so I don't. Really good. Let's see if I can download them. Right. Download them to the business. Under, I start having a.
Noises.
Oh. Maybe, there's actually not. Yes. So like, yeah. Yeah. Whenever that,
Yeah, I haven't called it.
well, we've got.
I love to be stored away at home.
Oh, really?
Fantastic.
I hate November. It's the worst.
I'm glad we're not having to go the other side of the state.
Yeah, well, I've got a brother.
Like the what? When you introduce yourself at the beginning, you said your middle name, I think that's.
Bennett, Bennett, Bennett.
Oh, yeah, we're.
I'll try to speak more clearly. You know, this whole thing here with this, I've never seen such a contraption.
First for me too. Although we have something similar at the main campus, but it's, not quite so isolating.
Yeah, whenever I testify,
That's almost like the cone of silence.
yeah, this is the kind of silence. It's like the Eichmann bubble when Eichmann was, you know, in the devil in Israel.
Yeah.
You know, and I've testified in military court, in, you know, court in Pierce County. And first of all, whenever I've testified, I've never had to wear a mask when I'm on the stand.
Yeah.
And even in military court, when everybody had to wear masks.
Yeah.
And then I've never had such a contraption here. It's really amazing.
protocols that have been instituted throughout the courthouse are significant and persistent.
Yeah.
There's been very little relaxation.
Wow. That's something.
Yeah.
Please.
Mm-mm-mm-mm.
Thank you for the transcripts.
Oh, you're welcome. Yes.
Mhm.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to see what the French company Oh, I have always said that I was hungry to walk in the mouth, but I mentioned all that I had a case in the bank and some years ago. At the time, I was three judges and all, at least in my eyes, looked like the active thing. Oh, someone who be here, please, is mad. And I mentioned that one of them got pulled for Eastern Washington position, and I was looking up to see who's still there. And, oh, I think there's a name on the three. So we no longer have a Mr. Paulson judiciary. Right, it just kind of it becomes this very long while, and we don't have that. So that's and my face after that. No, it was Spear one. And I couldn't remember the names. I looked at this case more than 6 years ago now. It was a weird case that had been going at the time. It was my longest. The case I participated in running the longest amount of time. I think it had been 7 or 8 years, and it was a dispute over policy language. But every time somebody does it, they're always so busy. They say, "Well, we can't hear it. We'll put you on." Like they give us. They got a trial set for this piece. They come in on emotion. They say, actually, we can have you for one of the emotions, and we keep trying, but you're not going to know what it is. For 6 months, it will probably be 10 years. I had one. It was, I think, frustrating for everyone. You really don't know which issue. I think it eventually fell, but not after I left from my working at the time. So I didn't
Tell you, never had a speeding ticket.
Well, that's why they can't do like any original. I was just shocked to learn that we had county seats in the state of Washington that didn't have Starbucks. It's like, how can this is I'm told now there's a Starbucks in the same place, so if I have to go there. no, just the presentation orders. I remember going for, and from Seattle, that's a drive, just to present an order. And I had to argue the motion for.
All rise. Board is in session.
Please be seated, thank you.
Your Honor,
Yes,
may we take a moment off record on everything?
yes. Let's go off the record, Ray.
I'm sorry.
I just saw him, court reporter, off the record.
So counsel spoke during the break. I got a conference call at 4:30 and then Paul advised that we're also apparently looking at gale force winds or something.
Oh, okay.
That's going through, so if it's okay with the court, we thought and this witness, obviously we're not going to be done with direct cross and redirect, so we'd like to break it forward, that's okay.
Yeah, just let me know when you want to stop and we'll call it a day. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go on the record, Ray. Mr. Fowl, please continue.
Dr. Wakeler, you ready?
Yes, sir.
So at the break, or before the afternoon break, we were looking at Plaintiff's Exhibit 63, page 3, and I was asking you questions about your evaluation interview with AK's mom, Nicole Baum. And I'm going to continue there. Down at the bottom of page 3, it says, Ms. Bond asked for help from other people, many of whom she had met through AA. The document says she was referred to a counselor who had helped her deal with her stress and who had accepted a sliding pay scale. When Ms. Bond spoke about her concerns about Junior, the counselor said that those were red flag indicators of sexual abuse. Is this Ms. Bond telling you about what the counselor told her?
That is my understanding.
Okay. And in your evaluation interview with Ms. Bond, did you gain an understanding of what the red flag indicators of sexual abuse were that the counselor was referring to?
Well, I would imagine the material that was referenced earlier in that page, on that page.
Okay. So the behaviors and the sexualized behaviors and the statements about scratching his butt and kissing penises, that sort of thing?
Yes.
All right. And if you look back at the paragraph, for a couple of months, Junior would continue to make the same troubling comments. It's the fourth full paragraph.
Yes.
At some point, AK told his mom that Eli kissed him, quote, down there, and pointing to his private part, correct?
Yes.
That's a disclosure, is it not?
I would call it a disclosure, yes.
And when you're assessing whether a child has been abused or not, I'm assuming a disclosure by the child is one of the things you're looking at, but not the only thing. Is that true?
That is true.
What are some of the other, especially a child this age? And this child was what, 5 or 6 years old when you interviewed him or observed him?
Yes, he would have been, he wouldn't have turned 5 until August of that year, actually, so he was still 4.
Okay, so he's pretty young.
Yes.
So you have a disclosure, her mom, I understand his mom relaying the disclosure to you. What other things are you looking for when you, as a forensic evaluator, are assessing whether the child has been abused or not?
Well, certainly, you know, when you talk about a disclosure to mom of something as explicit as saying Eli kissed him down there, we have the other behaviors that mom reported, sexualized behaviors, kind of rubbing up against her with his groin, that humping his younger brother. That is, these are not disclosures per se, but they're behaviors whose topography is suggestive of sexualized aggression, which hence often indicates sexual abuse.
So in this case, you have one, a disclosure by the child to his mom, and two, a series of multiple sexualized behaviors, right?
Yes.
Is there anything in this record, doctor, to indicate that AK, as of age 4, when you interviewed him, had been sexually assaulted or abused by anyone else other than Eli Tabor?
Not to my knowledge.
I know we've moved beyond plaintiff essay, but I want to go back now because I got to ask you this question. Is there any evidence in any records that essay was sexually assaulted or abused by anyone other than Eli Tabor?
Not to my recollection.
And did you review those counseling records that mom, Ms. Bond, was talking to you about?
I believe I did, because I think Mr. Cochran had sent them to me.
Okay. And is there anything of consequence that you noted?
You know, frankly, I can't recall what they said at this point in time.
And this report was issued 10 years ago. So
Yeah, nearly 10 years ago, yeah, since it was in January 2012, so almost 10 years ago.
if I look at the last paragraph on the page that begins, Ms. Bond then asked Junior some direct questions. So, and again, I'm reading your report. The way I read this is mom is telling you that she spoke to a therapist because she was having stress about the abuse. The counselor confirmed that the list of sexualized behaviors and the disclosure above were red flag indicators of sexual abuse. And then Ms. Bond went back and asked her son some direct questions about those indicators. Is that what you meant to report in your
Yes.
in these series of paragraphs?
Yes.
So apparently Ms. Bond then, after talking to a therapist, went back and asked him some direct questions about where he was being scratched and what did the child say?
In my butt.
Okay, and that's in quotes. So mom is telling you that the child told her that he was being scratched in his butt, correct?
Yes.
Did mom suggest to you any other possibility, like it might have been his brother or anything like that?
She did not.
Okay. Apparently, AK then bent over, pulled down his pull-up, which I assume is his diaper or underwear, and said inside, indicating inside his rectum, correct?
Seemingly.
Okay. Let me ask you about your testing of AK, or not AK. You tested his mom, correct?
His mom completed a developmental assessment of AK.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. And what did that assessment indicate?
That on measures of developmental competency, he was generally doing quite well, but was showing behavioral problems independent of his developmental competencies.
What do you mean by developmental competency?
Well, the Violent Adaptive Behavior Scales measures developmental competence in 4 major domains. Communication.
Doctor, you need to start over.
I'm sorry.
Start over for
Sure. The Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales measures developmental competence in 4 major domains. Those include communication, daily living skills, socialization, and motor skills. In addition, there are 2 scales that measure behavioral problems, including those that are considered internalizing and those that are externalizing. So when I say that with respect to his general developmental competence, that he was assessed as doing quite well, that his communication, for example, was seen as adequate across all realms. But I should point out that each of those four major developmental realms have, if you will, subsections or subcategories. So in communication has a receptive, expressive, and written subdomains. Each one of those he was seen as adequate when compared to his peers. With respect to daily living skills, we have personal, domestic, and community skills. And again, he was seen as adequate on two of them and one as moderately low. And so on. If you'd like, I can continue to describe.
Well, the reason I asked the question, if you go look up page 6 under the interview with AK section, you state that that he was interviewed over a 25-minute period, and then you say recently, 4 years of age, junior evidence somewhat delayed language and cognitive development. And I wondered how you reconcile your observation of the child and then the assessment
Of his mother.
of his mother.
Well, I would simply say that his mother is not a psychologist. And so to the extent that she was rating him, it would be based on her assessment of whether he could do tasks X, Y, and Z. In my interview with him, I saw him as somewhat lower on those areas. That's how I would explain the difference.
And you indicate at the bottom of the page, you state it was only within the domain of maladaptive behavior that problems are noted. Significant difficulties were also seen with both externalizing, and then on to page 7, internalizing subdomains with particularly difficulties within the domain of appropriate sexual behavior. What are you telling the reader there, Dr. Whitehead?
Well, the Vineland looks at behavior in terms of these two categories: internalizing, which might be a child who is somewhat withdrawn, and externalizing, a child who might act out aggressively, like, for example, rubbing up against his brother and engaging in dry humping, according to what his mother said. And there's a category within externalizing behavior that has to do with sexual acting out. That's one domain of externalizing behavior. And so those items were endorsed by his mother as being problematic.
Okay. Dr. Whitehill, I want you to turn your attention to your diagnostic section, and I believe you see this on page 8.
Right.
Let me know when you're there.
I'm there.
And the first axis 1 is sexual abuse of child, open trend R/O. Did you form an opinion as to whether this child, on a more probably than not basis, to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, had been abused?
I did, but I qualified it with a rule-out diagnosis.
And why is that?
Because unlike in the case of essay, where there had not been an explicit disclosure by the perpetrator and by essay in his interviews with Detective Kolb, here we have what seems to be a disclosure to mom, but it didn't have the same level of data support as the disclosures made by essay. Nonetheless, if we're looking at the standard of more likely than not, I would say that one could remove that or rule out diagnosis. But when I wrote this report, it seemed to me that there was still enough ambiguity in the reports so as to include that.
Okay. And but your opinion today, well, the evidence may be stronger in the SA case because of the explicit perpetrator disclosure. It's your opinion on a more probable than not basis that the evidence indicates that this child was abused, right?
Yes.
Okay. And what evidence is it that allows you to provide that opinion to the court?
Well, essentially the evidence that Junior shared with his mother, as reported by his mother, that there were enough concerning behaviors that were, as again, topographically sexual in nature, that suggests, in light of what we know about Mr. Tabor and AK's contacts with Tabor, would allow me to conclude that on a more probable than not basis, AK also was a victim of sexual abuse.
And does, and we talked a little bit about Tabor's diagnosis of being a polyperverse sexual offender. Does that play into your opinion that it's more likely than not that AK was abused by Tabor, even if you don't have the level of disclosure you have in the SAK?
The fact that he has multiple paraphilias, Tabor does, multiple domains of sexual deviance, was not a factor in my conclusion that AK is sexually abused, but rather the fact that Tabor appears to be what we would call a fixated pedophile that, from what we know of SA's disclosures and Tabor's own disclosures to law enforcement, Tabor had said, I think Tabor said 20 to 30 times, SA said 50 times. We have an individual whose acknowledged behavior, Tabor that is, indicates fixated pedophilic arousal pattern. And so it's that primarily rather than the other paraphilic variants, which leads me to this conclusion.
Under Axis 1, you also opine that AK suffers from disruptive behavior disorder. Do you have an opinion, Dr. Whitehill, whether the disruptive behavior disorder is related in whole or in part to the sexual abuse that you believe he suffered at the hands of Tabor?
I do.
And what is that opinion?
It is.
Okay, and what's the basis for that opinion?
The multiple externalizing behaviors that his mother recounted.
And you reference in Axis 4 psychological stressors, and I think you alluded to this before. You say likely victim of sexual assault. You're referring to Tabor, right? Not anybody else.
Likely victim, yes, that is correct.
And then parental separation and exposure to domestic violence between the parents. What's the significance of that to your overall diagnostic impression?
Well, we know that parental separation and exposure to domestic violence are known toxic behaviors for children. That they are reliably produce psychological symptoms in children who witness domestic violence. Parental separation is also considered a significant stressor in the life of the child. So we might expect to see particular symptoms arise in the wake of exposure just to those two events.
And is it common, doctor, for victims of childhood sexual abuse to be exposed to stressors other than the sexual abuse?
Yes. Oftentimes sexual abuse arises in households where there are other levels of dysfunction, domestic violence between the parents, inadequate supervision of the child, substance abuse among a caretaker. So there is a, if you will, a likelihood other levels of chaos. Plus, I would also mention that when there's been sexual abuse and a disclosure of sexual abuse, the impact of that disclosure may itself be traumatic to parents because it may generate significant disruption within the household.
And in terms of long-term outlook, how does being subject of multiple stressors affect the long-term prognosis for an abuse victim?
I think the extent to which there are multiple stressors results in a generally poorer prognosis, since the combined impact may be beyond cumulative. There may be some interaction between the stressors that again allows me to say that the whole may be greater than the sum of the parts. The level of trauma may be magnified by there being multiple traumatic events to which a child is exposed.
And if you're going to ask kind of the inverse of that, are children who may be exposed to other stressors more vulnerable to predators like paper?
I would say in general, yes. Of course, that depends upon the nature of the stressor. For example, when there's been parental separation and abandonment, and a parent who has to work to support the household without the previous breadwinner may have to put a child into daycare where the parent is less able to supervise the child. And if in the daycare there is somebody like Eli Tabor, of course, that creates greater vulnerability.
Under Axis 5, Global Assessment of Functioning, current level 60, can you translate what that means?
Yeah, that also reflects a somewhat, compared to essay, somewhat slightly higher level of functioning, still within the moderate range.
Under forensic conclusions, what forensic conclusion number 1? Let me ask you about that. He was never interviewed by law enforcement. What's the significance of that?
Well, the significance is that had he been interviewed and had he been, were he to be a competent witness or to have the capacity to understand what criminal behavior is, there might have been a record, there might have been disclosures. Of course, in light of AK's age at the time, and even at the time that I saw him, the likelihood is that he would be considered testimonially incompetent. Law enforcement, of course, does provide an opportunity for additional data that could be of great relevance in determining whether sexual abuse has occurred. But in this case, it didn't happen, and I think it perhaps didn't happen for pretty clear reasons.
And I took that to read. It didn't happen, and even if it did happen, the child's so young, you may not have obtained a clear disclosure anyhow. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think the key term for me would be the reliability of information provided by the child would be so suspect as to be not useful.
And despite the fact you don't have as clear disclosure as you have an essay, you're still comfortable opining on a more problem basis that it is likely that this child was abused by Kate, right?
I am.
Let's turn to conclusion number 2. AK's reported disclosure of concerning behaviors, some of which, and I'm reading from page 8, some of which, according to his mother, implicate Tabor directly. And I assume you're talking about the child saying, Eli, kiss my penis, and pointing to his private parts.
Yes.
Appeared to have been made only to his mother, Miss Bond. Nonetheless, she described consistently to the undersigned and to the OCS counselor, Deborah Darnell, a range of troubling comments and gestures, highly suggestive of exposure to sexual contact of the type known to have been perpetrated by Tabor. What do you mean by this conclusion?
Well, it indicates my conclusion that she made a number of comments, both to me and to the counselor, that, again, topographically, if we look at the form of the behavior, the nature of it as described, suggest sexual abuse. Now, this time of a type known to be perpetrated by Eli Tabor, because this had occurred in the aftermath of Tabor's arrest, and the disclosures made relative to SA. So we have now the kind of abuse he's already acknowledged with SA being reported by another child, in this case, AK.
And I assume that that conclusion is you make that conclusion as further evidence for support of your opinion that the child was abused and the child suffered psychological consequences as a result of that abuse.
Yes.
Is that fair? In conclusion, forensic conclusion number 3, you talk about those other stressors apart from Tabor's abuse, and we just talked about that. And you say, while such stressors are known to cause maladaptive behavior in children, the topography of AK's reported behavioral excesses, i.e. their sexualized nature, does not correspond to what one finds in children who witness domestic violence or who suffer abandonment. Can you explain to the court what you mean by that statement, Dr. Wiggum?
Yes. Again, there's been research on the impact on children of domestic violence. And what we see there are significant anxiety responses, fear, some physical aggression. We typically do not see sexualized aggression. So when we see sexualized aggression of a type reported by Nicole Bond, as well as this reported disclosure by AK pertaining to Eli, we can say, it seems to me reasonably enough, that this is not parental abandonment, this is not the impact of domestic violence, but this appears to be sexual abuse.
So you're seeing, at least as reported by Mom, sexually specific behavior that is different than you see in a child who is just getting a violent or chaotic home.
Right. Yes.
Let's turn to forensic conclusion number 4. And again, you talked about AK. Though AK is reported to evidence notable maladaptive behaviors of a sexualized nature. Sure. Though AK is reported to evidence notable maladaptive behaviors of a sexualized nature, he appears otherwise on track developmentally, according to the results of the BABS 2, which is the test you administered to Mom, right?
Yes.
And you say this is heartening, but it does not inoculate AK against future harm. What do you mean by that statement?
Well, to the extent the results of the Vineland are favorable, and as I pointed out, they're largely favorable. There were those behavioral excesses that I described in the section of internalizing and externalizing behaviors. But developmentally, he seems to be generally on track, at least as rated by Mom. However, what we know about the impact of sexual abuse is that there is quite often a delayed manifestation of consequences. Indeed, the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder essentially recognizes that for the exposure to traumatic events of many type, we do not immediately see the impact. And in the case of sexual abuse, it's quite often that the impact of being sexually abused in childhood does not manifest itself until the child begins experiencing sexual urges independently or learns about sexuality or perhaps is involved in an initial relationship. The caveat is that he's not inoculated against future harm, despite what seemed to be a favorable developmental assessment.
So it's great to be hitting milestones, but are you saying the literature suggests that in various developmental stages, he may have problems related to the childhood sexual abuse?
Yes.
And I assume that's the segue between paragraph 4 and 5, where you talk about sexual abuse in children is a known pathogen, and you here repeat, as you did in the essay report, some of the problems you and psychologists tend to see with victims of childhood sexual abuse, correct?
Yes.
And just for the record, what are some of those problems that are often seen as a result of childhood sexual abuse?
Well, I would say one common one is substance abuse. Substance abuse often used as a way to get some distance between the unpleasant emotional impact of the abuse that one may be re-experiencing by numbing oneself to feelings. Antisocial conduct is most often associated with boys who have been sexually abused. The presence of other psychological disorders in adulthood, including anxiety and depression, post-traumatic stress, as I've noted, are among the many sequelae of child sexual abuse.
And then you note at the bottom of that paragraph that counseling records reflect increased behavioral difficulties by AK at home, i.e. tampering and diminished compliance. I asked you earlier whether you reviewed the counseling records, and you said, I did, but I can't remember them. Is this a reference to the record you reviewed in 2011?
It would appear to be, yes.
So while he's meeting developmental milestones, you're also seeing some behavior problems beginning as early as age 4 with AK, right?
Yes.
And you suggest that they may increase in scope and intensity if not for continued intensive long-term therapeutic intervention. And that's your opinion?
It is.
Okay. And does that form the basis for your therapeutic life care plan?
It does.
I'd like you to turn to Exhibit 61, and again, for the record, to make sure I have the right exhibit, can you identify it?
Yes. You said 61?
61.
Okay. 61 is the mental health life care plan I prepared for AK.
All right. And I'm not going to take the time we spent with essay because you've explained what the modalities and the frequency and cost mean. But I note in the overall costs associated with AK's treatment, a lower total than you opine in essay. And the total is $229,800. Again, with the caveat that it might be more if AK needs relationship counseling, right?
Yes.
Why is this somewhat less in terms of frequency and cost than essays life care plan?
Well, available evidence indicates that the degree of harm experienced by AK, at least at the time of my assessment, is less. If we look merely at the Vineland adaptive behavior scales for each child, we see that AK was faring generally better in many realms. if we look at also what we know about the abuse to SA, by what Tabor himself acknowledges, we have anal penetration, we have repeated oral rape, 20 to 30 times as evidenced by Tabor against SA. Now, we don't know for sure that the abuse was less of AK, but the evidence certainly indicates that SA was abused to a significant and severe extent. And the evidence, at least as I've obtained at this time, suggests less harm and hence less need for services of the same intensity, but still a fairly intensive plan in any case.
And that's based on the problems you were seeing at the time when the child was 4.5 years old, right?
Yes.
And then you also state the areas of pain and suffering that AK, you're likely to see an AK, and they tend to be the same as you indicated you may see in SA. Why are they the same, given that the evidence is somewhat different in terms of what happened to the child and how the child is doing, or how the child is doing as of 2011?
Well, these are common consequences of child sexual abuse. Fear, trust, self-blame, impaired relationship performance. We see those independent of the severity or chronicity of a particular abusive act. These are associated consequences of sexual abuse. Now, the extent to which any given one appears, the extent to which any given one of those is of a particular duration or frequency or intensity is hard to predict. One knows from the literature that the extent of sexual abuse and the nature and chronicity, which is to say how long the abuse has occurred, and the frequency of abuse within the duration, how often the abuse occurred, is associated with greater symptoms. And so now we understand that SA is likely to have greater symptoms from what we know. But we can't discount the fact that AK may also have symptoms of this type.
And that's why these are estimates, obviously, right?
Oh yes, this is a predictive model. This is not absolute certainty by any means.
And there was some testimony from a lawyer, not a psychologist or a doctor today, that children who are very young, under the age of 4, may not have narrative memory, and therefore there'll be no lasting effect from the sexual abuse. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
I disagree, although I suppose it's kind of a more complex question. I agree that children aren't likely to have a narrative memory when they're so young, but there are other dimensions of memory that have to do with emotional memory, have to do with body memory, that are persistent, even in children as young as 4. And I guess there are studies which will reflect that. Children younger than 4, when seen years later, are likely to have particular symptoms of mental disorder, and mental disorder of various types.
In other words, when young children are abused, the literature supports that those children may grow up to have problems associated with the abuse, correct?
Yeah, I would say are likely to grow up with problems, yes.
And when you were talking about the robust literature that has even grown in the 10 years since you authored this report, that's what you're referring to?
Yes.
Your Honor, I was going to change families, so this is a little before, but that it might just be a good time to break.
Okay, thanks. Let's go off the record. I don't know what to tell the parties insofar as reconvening. I'll just ask you to confer with Christine, my JA, and whenever I'm available, whenever the parties and witnesses are available, that's when we'll do it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Court's in recess.
All right.
And Doctor, what that meant is you're gonna have to come back. But we don't know when.
I kind of figured as much.
All right. Doctor, we'll be in touch
Okay.
about dates.
Okay.
You better-
Oh, you know.
you're in trouble. Can we manage the sort of? If you're done.
You're done for the day. Go home now.
Anyway,
See you there. I don't see, that's what that water. You know, I will take one. Oh. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Actually, we're still operating.
Yeah, all day.
You mean for the crash and for the sinking of the boat?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Oh. Oh, there's a stretch.